Hello, this is Steve Palladino from Palladino Power Project, and I'm bringing you this video where I want to discuss racing performance potential in running and tie in a little bit of training aspects of that, and in particular, look at from the power perspective. Of course, when we are looking at racing performance potential, we're talking about modeling performance potential, racing outcomes in running, and what are the various elements that go into it. Well, we know that performance on race day, it's dependent on multiple variables, and they vary from fitness at the start of a training plan and how well health and injury status is maintained, not only for at the beginning of the plan what the entry status is, but also during the plan, avoiding injury and illness, compliance with the plan, responsiveness to the various training prescriptions, and then ultimately the conditions on race day and how the race is executed. All of that goes into performance on race day. But I want to approach this from the standpoint of just the power related variables that determine performance, all else being equal. So we control all these variables. What are the elements that impact your performance on race day? And if we're looking at it from a physiologic perspective, you look at VO2 max or velocity of VO2 max, lactate threshold, velocity lactate threshold, and runner's running economy, submaximal running economy. And there are actually models, there are algorithms, models that are used as predictive for various race distances using various physiologic metrics. But we're talking about power, the power perspective, using data derived from power meters, from sensors that the runners were using, and data that's derived in the field, as opposed to going to the lab for physiologic testing. And there are four elements that are critical in determining running performance. Again, all else being equal, all conditions are the same, and the execution is optimal. It's the training plan is consistent, and the runner's been compliant with it and they're responsive to it, etc. All those other variables we're putting aside and looking at the determinants from a power perspective that determine your race performance. Now, I say four here, but really there are it's three and three. Think of it as three and three, depending on the race duration. All right, so the functional threshold power, critical power of the runner is an important factor, maybe the most important factor, but it's not the only factor. The running effectiveness is another one. We're going to discuss that in just a moment. And if the races are longer than the time to exhaustion when running at FTP-CP, so for if you're looking at a population, the time to exhaustion at FTP-CP is roughly about 50 minutes plus or minus 20 minutes. So that's 30 minutes to 70 minutes, where the elites are sort of in the upper end of that time to exhaustion population range, and recreational racers are at the lower end of that time to exhaustion range. But just use 50 minutes plus or minus 20 as a population range. And if the race is longer than that, then the fatigue resistance in those sub threshold, those powers that are lower than critical power, lower than functional threshold power, because the race is longer than time to exhaustion. So by nature, power and duration, they have to be a lower power. Then how well you maintain, or how the slope of the degradation of power with time becomes an important factor. Fatigue resistance. And for races that are under or less than the time to exhaustion of at FTP, particularly when you start getting to races below 30 minutes, where we know pretty much the whole population, their time to exhaustion at FTP-CP is probably 30 minutes or longer. When you're under 30 minutes, reserve work capacity becomes very important. But technically, it's anything less than time to exhaustion. At FTP-CP, this becomes an important factor. So in races that are longer, it's FTP, running effectiveness, and the fatigue resistance. And for races that are shorter, 5K and less, say, then it's FTP and running effectiveness and reserve work capacity. They just flip-flop these two criteria here in determining the running performance potential. So let's go into those in a little bit more detail. CP and the time of exhaustion at CP are factors, and as I said, probably among the most important factors. And I might as well call it FTP-CP. If during this discussion I use one term and not the other, take it as I'm actually wanting to say both FTP and CP, as they are essentially functionally, conceptually the same thing. All right, so that's one important thing, and this is really important because as we look at races, that time to exhaustion. Again, if we're just using population base, it's 50 minutes plus or minus 20, but it's going to be per individual as well. Will be important in determining which factors are the critical ones. Running effectiveness is speed-power ratio. It's basically how effectively one translates power into speed. So you can have two runners that produce the exact same watts per kilogram for roughly 20 minutes, but one of them converts power to speed more effectively. In other words, has a higher running effectiveness. That person is going to go faster, all else being equal. The one with a higher running effectiveness, even for two runners with the same power, in terms of watts per kilogram, that is. I have arrows pointed to a number of different things because we have our durations. Down here is roughly 1,500 mile, and then we have roughly 5,000 and roughly 10,000, roughly half marathon. Well, I have those arrows there drawn there to remind me that running effectiveness not only varies across individuals, so some people are less effective at converting power to speed, some are more, but also within that given runner, running effectiveness tends to decline as duration gets longer. So running effectiveness for 1,500 is going to generally be higher than for 5,000 or 10,000 or a half marathon. So those are a few important things to understand about running effectiveness. But in the end, as you can see, as I'm getting around to it, you can see not only is critical power, but how effective someone is at converting their power into speed important determinants in terms of race performance. Now we come back to this time to exhaustion at critical power FTP. When races are longer than that, then fatigue resistance, and I'm using fatigue resistance here in a very constrained way. I'm using fatigue resistance to talk about the degradation or the slope of that power duration beyond critical power time to exhaustion. So, someone with poor fatigue resistance might decline at a higher slope, and someone with higher fatigue resistance is going to decline at a lower slope. So, in other words, basically, someone with higher fatigue resistance is going to retain a higher percentage of their critical power as they go further to the right on their power duration curve for races further to the right. Where someone with lower fatigue resistance is going to retain a lower percentage of their critical power as they move further and further right on their power duration curve. So fatigue resistance, and again, I'm using it in a very constrained manner. I mean, essentially, you can say time to exhaustion at FTP or critical power. That in and itself is sort of a measure of fatigue resistance, but I'm not including that in this discussion. In other words, you can have a runner and train their critical power. Critical power may not change upwards that much, but the time to exhaustion for that runner at critical power may get longer and longer. So that's another. If you're broadening the definition of fatigue resistance, that would be another one. Another would be, let's say someone's time to exhaustion at VO2 max is 3 minutes and 30 seconds, and they work on it, and they're able to expand their time to exhaustion at VO2 max to 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Well, that's sort of a expanding fatigue resistance at VO2 max as well. Those are other areas of fatigue resistance that can be included in a broader topic, but I'm keeping it somewhat narrow, using fatigue resistance for this aspect of the power duration curve on the right, to the right of time to exhaustion of at critical power FTP. Still another factor, and again, this is for races less than time to exhaustion at FTP, is reserve work capacity. And reserve work capacity is essentially the finite capacity for work that can be done in excess of FTP. So you can see that's this horizontal line going to the y-axis over here. For this athlete, about 329 watts. And if this athlete is running a race, say an 800-meter race, then their capacity, their power for 800 meters, let's say it's 2 minutes, a 2-minute 800-meter runner, their power is going to be FTP plus this reserve work capacity that's completely utilized or expended in a 2-minute period. So reserve work capacity determines this line here, how much power we're getting above critical power for any given duration, less than time to exhaustion at FTP. So that's an important determinant in races that are less than time to exhaustion at FTP CP. So as we get into this, I'm going to go into some demonstration using the super power calculator so you can see how these variables play out and how they do affect performance. We're going to go into scenarios that are longer races that are longer than time to exhaustion at FTP. So we'll utilize marathon in that case, and we'll go into utilizing those variables that are applicable for races that are less than time to exhaustion at FTP, CP, 5K being a good example. So we're going to use some scenarios for both marathon as well as 5K, where in marathon we're using FTP, CP, uh, running effectiveness, and fatigue resistance. And for the 5K, it'll be critical power FTP, um, and running effectiveness and reserve work capacity. I should probably add that reserve work capacity is known by other names, including W prime, particularly in the scientific literature, FRC, and others in various platforms. Um, I'm also should elaborate that fatigue resistance is essentially, if I wanted to boil it down to a single model using the Riegel model, the Riegel exponent essentially is modeling fatigue resistance. So we'll get to that in the example where the Riegel exponent is the quantifiable measure of fatigue resistance, and in this case, it's reserve work capacity. All right, so just a couple of other little notes before getting into some of the examples. And keep in mind that these variables will respond to training in to different magnitudes. It's in other words, it's easier to grow your FTP CP than it might be for fatigue resistance in some cases. Certainly, it's easier to grow your FTP than it is to grow your running effectiveness. And it's easier to grow your FTP than it is to grow your reserve work capacity. So they all have a certain amount that they can grow in an effective training plan. And the other thing to keep in mind is that depending on emphasis, they may change more or less in concert with each other, although usually fatigue resistance in the sense that we're talking about and reserve work capacity might go in opposite directions. Just as critical power and FTP might go in opposite directions as reserve work capacity in some cases, depending on training emphasis and race targets, etc. But those are just a few variables that I wanted to talk about in terms of what you can expect with training with these important factors in determining running race performance. And just one last little point here. I already mentioned that in some cases you might see one grow more than the other, and in fact, I've seen it where an athlete reaches they're getting closer to their quote unquote theoretic max for FTP CP. In other words, they're not growing that very much anymore, but yet with training volume and continued training consistency over duration, the fatigue resistance grows. So there's a lot of variables where you might see one grow more so than the other, and if your blinders are on such that this is all you see, this is all you track is your FTP CP, and you're trying to evaluate, is my training program working? If that's all you're looking at, you're missing some important things. That you may not get a big changes in FTP on CP tests, etc., repeatedly, But this might be growing over here, or this might be improving a little bit over here, even though you're not necessarily seeing this, these big percentages of FTP growth. All right, so let's go into some examples now. And let's start with looking at an athlete, a 70 kilogram athlete that has a FTP CP of 350 watts. And we're going to see how these variables play out in a marathon performance for this particular athlete. I'm using the superpower calculator. I'm using this particular model right here, which uses the Riegel model and running effectiveness in determining race performance, as opposed to this one, which I'll get to in just a moment. So once again, as we look at this athlete for marathon, 350 watts, 70 kilograms, let's say they have a sort of an average running effectiveness, a fairly good, actually for marathon, an average but fairly good running effectiveness of 0.96. All right. And we could see that for this athlete, let's say their fatigue resistance is minus 0.08, then their time is going to be about 2:41. All right. So let's go back and let's just change this. Let's say they grow their FTP, and fortunately, playing in this fashion, we could isolate variables, and whereas things may change in concert, we're going to isolate variables. So let's say it grows 2% to 362 watts, and we go back to the scenarios again. Same fatigue resistance, the minus 0.08 Riegel exponent, same running effectiveness. So those things haven't changed, but he's grown his CP by 2%. And you can see that the power expected for the race is a little bit higher, and the time is down to 2:35. All right, by that growth. All right, so let's go back and let's go back to the original, but let's come back here and play with the other variables. Let's say the person's CP doesn't grow, their running effectiveness doesn't grow, but let's say they improve their fatigue resistance from minus 0.08 to minus 0.07. This is over a long period of time, because this is not going to be in a matter of a couple of months. But let's say over a period of a couple of years, they haven't changed much, but their fatigue resistance has grown. You can see where they back when they're minus 0.08, their performance potential was about 241, but now it's about 239, simply because of growing that fatigue resistance as quantified by the Riegel exponent. Lastly, again, same runner. Let's look at keeping FTP the same, and we're going to go back to that minus 0.08, but let's say their running effectiveness improved. And now we can see that they went from here, let's do this so we can compare them side by side. So same fatigue resistance, but running effectiveness improved from minus 0.96 to minus 0.97. Their projected time, their power's higher marginally, but for roughly the same power, their time is improved because they're more effective at converting power to speed. So they've essentially dropped 2 minutes off of their marathon time because this is improved. All right. All right. So let's reset those factors again. And so that explains how in a race that's longer than time to exhaustion at FTP, that there's three variables: the runner's critical power, or FTP, their running effectiveness, and their fatigue resistance. And with those three, you can model their performance quite well. And in training, those are the variables that we hope to see some change in, although some, again, change a little bit more so, or more changeable than others with training. They're more responsive to training. All right, let's go to the other example. We're going to keep the athlete is going to be exactly the same, but now let's look at this athlete running a 5K race. So we're going to come down here and we're going to change to a 5K race. And now, if we come over here to scenarios, notice how Riegel exponent is grayed out, because that fatigue resistance that applies to races longer than time to exhaustion and FTP, that goes away. But what comes into play now is that athlete's reserve work capacity. So let's look at these three variables: CP, FTP, and running effectiveness, and reserve work capacity, how they play roles in determining performance outcome. So again, same athlete, 70 kilograms, 350 watt CP, FTP, and their reserve work capacity, we'll just say, is 9 kilojoules. And their running effectiveness is going to be higher in a 5K. So let's say their running effectiveness is 0.99 at 5K, as opposed to 0.96. All right, so for this runner, you can see with 350 watt CP, FTP, 9 kilojoule reserve work capacity, and running effectiveness is 0.99, projecting about a 1624. You don't really need to look at one line here. We're looking at a projected time of 1624 and projected power of 359 watts. So let's do the same thing. Let's say the person improved their FTP by 2%, up to 362 watts. And what does that do to their 5K time? So that 2% improvement, they still have the same 9 kilojoule reserve work capacity. They still have the same 0.99 running effectiveness. Their power now bumps up to 371 watts, and they're able to get under 16 minutes, 15:52. So a very nice improvement with that CP improvement. All right, let's again go back, and we're going to just play with one variable at a time. Let's say this time the runner does a lot of work on the reserve work capacity. So they're working on the left-hand side of their power duration curve. And let's say they bump it up, and let's say they bump it to 10 kilojoules. All right. So they at 9 kilojoules, remember 1624, 359 watts. We increase that to 10 kilojoules because they're working on the left-hand side of the power duration curve, but they're maintaining that FTP. Same reserve running effectiveness. This is what happens. Their time will improve a couple of seconds. And their power goes up. Let's say they improve their reserve work capacity to 11 kilojoules, which is a pretty sizable improvement. Same running effectiveness. Now they bumped it up another watt, and they've dropped off another couple of seconds. All right, but nevertheless, it does play a role in that performance of that athlete. Lastly, let's look at this one. If we kept things at 350 watts, 9 kilojoules, but somehow the runner increased their running effectiveness to 1.00 over the course of a long training period, now they've dropped from 1624 to 1614. So they've dropped 10 seconds off their time just by improving the effectiveness with which they convert power to speed. So there you have it. There's three variables that determine performance depending on your race. Um, the factors may be FTP, fatigue resistance, and running effectiveness if it's a longer race, or maybe FTP, running effectiveness and reserve work capacity if it's a shorter race. So again, we can model fairly well performance potential with all else being equal, um, and come up with pretty good what that person's potential is, all else being equal. Um, Also, in this, keep in mind that the responsiveness it will vary across athletes, across the type of training, the training emphasis, um, and if you're only looking at one thing, you may be missing other things that are growing. So, hopefully, that helped your understanding of the variables that we're looking to train, the variables that we model in looking at race performance in runners using the power perspective. Thank you for watching. We'll catch you next time.